The final day of Chanukah coincides with summer solstice in Australia. When we kindle the last light of the menorah, the sun will be at its peak down under. But it is dark on Bondi Beach and difficult to see. The golden sand is red with the blood of innocent Jews. For our people, even the luminous glow of the full menorah will not lift the shadows. This is the winter of our discontent. May the souls of our murdered brothers and sisters be bound up in the bond of everlasting life, and may God bring to the wounded a complete and speedy recovery. From sunset of October 7th, 2023, when I observed the hate mobs gathering on the streets of the West's most iconic landmarks, I sensed that this war that Hamas unleashed on Israel would test not only the Jewish state and not only the Middle East, but most critically, the West itself. On October 9th, when blood was still gushing through the streets of Israel and terrorists were still bombing and killing, and 250 hostages, babies, children, parents, and grandparents were bustled, blindfolded into the dank tunnels. On that day, October 9th, a hate mob gathered outside the Sydney Opera House, waving Hamas flags and yelling, "Gas the Jews." Some contend that they didn't actually shout, "Gas the Jews," only, "Where are the Jews?" As if "Where are the Jews" is better, somehow cleaner, more sanitized, more clean, less threatening. I was deeply worried, not primarily by the hate mob. Alas, the world is saturated with hateful people. It was the lack of effective response by Australian authorities, the nonchalance, the underplaying of the risk to Australia itself by those advancing a distortion, corruption, and perversion of Western values. The institutions of democracy are the guardrails of liberty, protecting free societies. If they do not rise up to protect our way of life, if they ignore, indulge, tolerate, or instigate violence and hate, everything we hold dear will collapse. We tend to forget how precious, how delicate, and how vulnerable liberty is. And it wasn't only Australia. In our country, too, and throughout Europe, universities, elite schools, and human rights organizations couldn't even bring themselves to express compassion with the victims of Hamas, let alone condemn the perpetrators, even before Israel responded militarily. Not only did they avoid condemning Hamas, some considered the massacres legitimate resistance. These were our decades-long partners, brothers and sisters in arms. Jews helped build America's great universities. We devoted ourselves to civil liberties and human rights, participating in and helping to found some of America's preeminent civil rights organizations. Rabbi Stephen Wise himself was a founding board member of the ACLU and the NAACP. Parts of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were drafted in my father's conference room at the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C. Is this really happening? I remember asking myself over and over again. What business do progressives have supporting those who oppress women, gays, minorities, Christians? How could feminist organizations, with whom we marched arm in arm, not condemn horrific sexual violence against Israeli women? How to explain that the very people who insist that women should be assumed to be telling the truth about sexual assaults demanded proof from Israeli women, refusing to consider the evidence, the stark evidence in front of their eyes. I've been a liberal my entire adult life. What I saw on the streets of the West and in its most elite and distinguished institutions of learning, and increasingly in the mainstream of the political parties, was not liberalism. It was a betrayal of liberalism. It wasn't even progressive. It was regressive and posed an immediate threat because the well-being of the West and the West's Jews depends on the inculcation of liberal values and a willingness to defend them. The passion unleashed by an illiberal state of mind are never good for Jews. And history teaches that once Jew hatred is normalized, democracy and decency decay. What starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. Jews are the West. It's why global jihad targets Jews first. The building blocks of Western civilization come from our Bible. Freedom, liberty, dignity. All human beings created in the image of God and thus endowed with certain unalienable and equal rights on earth and in the sight of God. We cautioned incessantly for 2.5 years that the savage assault on Israel will not end with Israel. Sderot will come to Sydney, we warned, because both are fueled by the same anti-Western ideology. Be'eri will come to Brooklyn. Nir Oz will come to Notting Hill. First the Jews, then the Jews of the West, then the West itself. Open your eyes, we cautioned. Don't make excuses. If murder is wrong, it is universally wrong, even against Jews. If rape is wrong, it is universally wrong, even against Jews. If kidnapping is wrong, it is universally wrong, even against Jews. If terrorism is wrong, it is universally wrong, even against Jews. I've met some of the heroes of October 7th. Astoundingly courageous police officers of Sderot and the Nova Festival, who, when heaven was falling and the earth's foundations fled, on their shoulders held the sky suspended. I don't know what degrees they earned in school, but they knew in every fiber of their being the difference between murder and self-defense, between barbarism and decency, between the use of force to take life and the use of force to protect and preserve life. They didn't need morally warped political science lectures from the learned faculty of Columbia University's Middle East Studies Department. Defend Western values, we pleaded. Do not give in to the intimidation of the mob, whether on the seething streets or the ivory towers. Do not encourage or indulge the demonization of Israel and Judaism. It might be true that the right to free speech entitles one to shout, "Globalize the Intifada," and Palestine free from the river to the sea. The mob outside Park East Synagogue last month might have had the right to stand at the entrance to this house of worship and spew whatever hate was on their mind. But presidents and prime ministers and national and political leaders also have the right to free speech. In fact, they have the obligation to counter hateful and dangerous speech. University presidents, principals of schools, teachers, moral authorities, clergy, they also have the right to free speech. In fact, they have the obligation to counter hateful and dangerous speech. And every one of the hundreds of millions of Americans also has the right to free speech. Parents, you also have the right to free speech. You have the right to speech in your children's schools. And kids, you also have the right to free speech. Representatives in the thousands of municipal councils and townships across the depths and breadth of this country, you also have the right to free speech. You have the right, in fact, the moral obligation to counter rhetoric and legislative initiatives that promote the hatred of Jews. There is a direct connection between hateful words tolerated, ignored, or even encouraged by authorities and hateful deeds. What people all too casually call violence does not emerge out of nowhere. Bondi Beach was not a natural disaster, a tsunami, a tornado, a hurricane that struck without warning. Hateful deeds are the end results of hateful thoughts and hateful words, indulged, coddled, appeased, or encouraged by moral, political, legal, and civic authorities. Globalize the Intifada means Bondi Beach. It means the attack on a Manchester synagogue on Yom Kippur. Armed struggle means the firebombing of a peaceful march in support of Israeli hostages in Boulder, Colorado. Palestine free from the river to the sea means October 7th. Free Palestine means the murder of Israeli embassy staffers in Washington, D.C. These are not calls for coexistence, for a Palestinian state living side by side with a Jewish state. It's not even about the well-being of suffering Gazans. Because if it were about them, there would be worldwide marches demanding that Hamas fulfill the requirements of the UN Security Council to lay down its arms, demilitarize Gaza, and get on to the second phase of the Gaza plan to improve the lives of Gazan civilians. Where are the protesters? Where are the marches? Where are the demands to improve the lives of Gazan civilians? Now, I want to reiterate what I've said publicly many times in the past few weeks. The normalization of anti-Zionism normalizes anti-Semitism. It's not criticism of Israel. that is a red herring. I meet a lot of Jews. I have never met a Jew in my life who considers the criticism of the Israeli government to be ipso facto anti-Semitic. Jews ourselves are the most severe critics. It is the war against the very existence of Israel, the delegitimization of collective Jewish self-determination and dignity that leads to the delegitimization of Judaism and Jewish values. Anti-Israel hate feeds an atmosphere of anti-Jewish hate. It fuels the absurd gaslighting from people who are themselves not even Jewish, who deign to teach us what constitutes authentic Judaism. Liberties they would never take with any other minority or religion. They lecture us that Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism, and that the state of Israel has nothing to do with the land of Israel or the people of Israel. Come on. There's been a sincere and authentic outpouring of sorrow since the bloodbath on Bondi Beach. But the blindness remains. An inability on the part of some and a refusal on the part of others to see the connection between Bondi Beach and Be'eri. Why is the murder of 16 Jews in Sydney so morally clear to so many, while the murder of 100 times more Jews in Israel in their bedrooms is somehow morally opaque? Demonize and dehumanize Israeli Jews. Indulge those who seek to kick Israel and Jews out of public spaces, publishing houses, concert venues, soccer stadiums, Eurovision Song Contest. Boycott everything Israeli, including artists and academics. March against synagogues in Manhattan with little effective response by political and moral authorities. And then you're surprised that Jews are hunted on Bondi Beach? One of the things most Jews still ask themselves nearly a century after the Holocaust is, if I needed help, would my friendly neighbor risk his livelihood, safety, perhaps even his life to hide me? We can't help ourselves. We're still living with this generational trauma 4 generations after the Holocaust. I recently interviewed Jonathan Friedland on my podcast. He wrote a fascinating book about resistors in Nazi Germany. He told me that researchers concluded that most people would like to believe about themselves that they would stand up to hate and do the right thing. But in truth, only 5% of human beings actually do. The rest of us do not take the risk, not only to life, liberty, and property, but even social opprobrium from virtual hate mobs is enough to silence us. A word to our brothers and sisters who are not Jewish. If there was ever a time that you said to yourselves, we will stand by the Jewish community, we will not allow Jew hatred to return to our towns and neighborhoods, this is the time. Our community is hurt, anxious, and lonely. It has been the condition of Jews for centuries, this sense of existential aloneness. embrace your Jewish friends, express solidarity with our community. We are less than 2% of the American population and 0.2% of the world's population. We have still not recovered the number of Jews who were alive on the eve of World War II, nearly a century later. Half of the remaining 15 million Jews in the world live in Israel. Destroy Israel, and you have destroyed the oldest continuous civilization in the West, and much of the West along with it. It is precisely what the globalized, the Intifada crowd seeks. The mob outside Park East Synagogue shouted, "Make them scared." That's what they want, to make the Jewish community afraid. To our good and decent fellow Americans, don't let them. Stand up to them. This has been an awful week. I was shattered by the news of the killings at Brown University. Many members of our synagogue study at or have graduated from Brown. The cutting down of young people with so much promise at the beginning of their life's journey just crushes me. We have several Brown students with us today. May you be comforted and comfort each other. And may you live long and productive lives, lives filled with kindness and understanding. And there are rays of light and reasons for hope. Among the heroes of Bondi Beach was Ahmad al-Ahmad, a Syrian Muslim immigrant to Australia, who fought with one of the terrorists and disarmed him, and was shot and severely wounded in the confrontation. He was among those rare human beings, the 5% of us, who stood up to evil, even at great personal risk. He, not the haters with all their fancy degrees, he charts the way forward. We can live in peace if we recognize the other's humanity. To all our young people and their parents, find your way back to Judaism. Study its teachings. Learn its values. Not from TikTok, not from Instagram, not from newspapers, and not from anti-Zionists, most of whom are not even Jewish. Learn from rabbis who have absorbed thousands of years of Jewish wisdom. Be proud Jews. Defend and protect our people. You are part of a tradition that never yields to despair, no matter how dark the day. We affirm that light will shine on humanity. Dark days will always become brighter. Night yields to day, darkness to the swift sunrise of dawn. Our tradition teaches that even during the darkest days, God is not absent, simply hidden. There's no endless night in Judaism, no endless suffering. Sooner or later, the morning star appears, heralding brighter times. Talmudic sages asked, what is the miracle of the first night of Chanukah? Everyone agreed that there was enough oil to burn for one day. So why then do we recite the blessing of the miracle of Chanukah she'asa nisim la'avotenu bayamim hahem bazman hazeh, who performed miracles for us. Why do we recite that blessing on the first night? A one-day supply of oil burned for one day. What's the miracle? The tradition explains that the miracle of the first night was taking ordinary material, oil, and dedicating it to extraordinary purposes, freedom. Why recite the miracle of the oil on the first night of Chanukah? Because that ordinary oil was the inspiration for extraordinary human efforts, the rededication to freedom. This is our challenge, to take the ordinary and make it extraordinary. Bring light to a dark world. Sustain hope for humanity. Contribute to its well-being. Every flicker of light we bring, every good deed, every act of courage confronting evil, nourishes goodness and brings closer the day of peace. May the light of liberty, decency, and human dignity burn bright for all who dwell on this good earth.